All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. Those of you in the audience and those of you that have attended remotely, thank you. My name is Sean Goulet. I am in the Professional Services Division, and I'm in the Atlantic Delivery Center. And this is Sam. Sam?
Yeah, hey, I'm Sam. I'm also in Professional Services, based out of the Midwest Delivery Center. So, yeah, we have a good amount of work. We're both kind of software engineers within the Professional Services Division, so we do a good amount of customizing Experience Builder.
Yeah, and so that's why we're here today, so thank you for joining. Yeah, next slide. All right, so our agenda today is to kind of run through an intro to Experience Builder. And I'll stop right there. How many in the audience have actually downloaded the developer edition of Experience Builder to date? All right, so a majority of the audience, good, great. So we'll go through the intro, especially for those that haven't downloaded the developer edition. We'll talk about custom widgets, code collaboration, and then go through some options for deployments of widgets and applications and what your options there, depending upon your organization type, whether you're enterprise or online. Yeah, so getting into Experience Builder, next slide. At its core, Experience Builder is an application builder. So just like any what you see is what you get builder, it allows you to build a website that you can deploy on a server and send out to your audience, whether it be internal, external, public, private, behind firewalls, outside of firewalls. It's a web application. And the power of Experience Builder comes in when you connect to ArcGIS data. And there's different types of data sources in Experience Builder, web maps, data types, also feature services, and others. And so you can plug into your data, and then you can also configure widgets that are used within the application. So it ships with out-of-the-box widgets and a growing list. If you have stopped by, you've seen probably the roadmap for 2024 over where we have a post on the floor. And if you haven't, come on by. The team, the Experience Builder team, members from the team, the core team are here. And we're happy to help you and talk through what is coming and what we're working on. And towards the for our talk today, we're going to be talking about extending and customizing widgets. So building your own or extending some widget that is out there that doesn't fit 100% your business needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of go off on that, so Experience Builder does come with a bunch of configured widgets that you can, or pre-built widgets that you can configure and kind of use out of the box with your existing feature layers, your existing web maps, most of anything that you kind of have in enterprise, any kind of piece of data, you can pull it in, use things like layer list or legend, things that you can implement into a custom web app or a custom Experience Builder app, and without needing to actually have a developer go through and use our JavaScript SDK to create that application. So that's one of the biggest draws to Experience Builder, but something you quickly will realize is Experience Builder might not provide the functionality that you're looking for out of the box. And so that's where our talk today comes in, is helping you understand what developing a custom widget might mean, how you can extend this system of pre-configured or pre-built widgets and systems, and how we can actually get started with developing our own extensions of the Experience Builder software. So extensibility is a very big part of what Experience Builder has to provide.
Yeah, and so towards that end, the builder, right? There's different versions of the builder, and so you have the online builder, which your organization can configure an application using out-of-the-box widgets. Currently, there's no functionality to add a custom widget when you're using the online builder. Conversely, if you're using the enterprise version and you have enterprise 10.8.1 or above, then you're able to 10.8.1 or above, you have the builder. And then once you get to 11.0 or above, you can add custom widgets that your configuration team can make use of. So you as developers can develop the widget, deploy it, share it to a portal that enterprise is tied to, or part of that enterprise. And then your configuration folks can go in there and add that widget, reuse it in other applications, and configure it. And then we have the builder that comes with the developer edition. And so that's what we use when we're actually developing the widget. And that's what we use to run the build prod command, the npm command, to actually compile the widget so that it can be then deployed on a server that is accessible to your enterprise stack and add.
Yeah, and so a lot of, like one of the biggest differences is when you're working with it in online and enterprise, it's hosted through online and enterprise. With a developer edition, you're able to create widgets that you can put those in an enterprise environment, but you also have the option of exporting your entire experience, which we'll get a little into later on what that actually means. Basically, you can create a web application that you can deploy on a server in pretty much any environment. So that there's definitely there's usefulness in being able to just have that, have your experiences exist on ArcGIS Online and Enterprise, but there is also a lot of pluses to being able to basically generate an index.html, a compiled basically web app that you can deploy on any server that you might already have. So that's yeah.
Yeah. Excited. So, so when we talk about the developer edition, the first step obviously is downloading it from our ArcGIS developer site. And when we download it, see if you want to show that, yeah. So here's the download site. 1.13 is the current version. You see that got released in November. The next version is scheduled to release within the next couple weeks. So 1.14 will be added, and it will have all the updates that the online builder has. So with that, one of the biggest needs that I see is a group filter widget. So the filter widget turns into, you can have a configuration to actually interact with multiple data sources at once. So it becomes a group filter at that point. So that's coming in the next couple weeks. So downloading it and then running it. So if we open up the, do you want to open up the terminal?
Yeah.
Okay. And really, when you download it, at the core, it has a server and a client directory. And the server directory is where the actual builder application lives, and the client directory is where the compiler of your widget and all your widgets live, in the out-of-the-box widgets as well. And so obviously you need Node.js, and there's documentation online on what versions you should be running depending upon what version Experience Builder Developer Edition that you're using. But when you run it, there's only 2 commands at the beginning, npm CI, which takes into account the package lock.json, the versions of those packages that are being used by the server and the client. You have to run it in both. And then just npm start. And that starts up the server that is the builder, and then the client that is the actual widget compiler. And so this is what it looks like in VS Code when you have 2 terminals open. Sam?
Yeah, so if we actually kind of look at where you can start. For example, say we just downloaded this SDK from the website. You can go here and download it. Once you do that, you can actually open it up in something like VS Code. You can see, as we were talking about earlier, we have a client and a server folder. And so what we'll actually do, just to start out with, is we'll open up a terminal, and you can see currently we are in Experience Builder, and we navigated to the server folder. So once you first initialize by doing npm install, I'm not going to do it because we've already done it already. You'll run through that. It's going to download the dependencies from online, and it will get your project initialized. So once you're able to do that, you can run this command npm start, and that's actually essentially going to start a local server where you can then interact with the local developer edition. So once I run that, you can see we get some commands, and then it says an HTTP server is running on port 3000. So now if we open up a browser and actually go to, let's see where I have this. If we open up localhost 3001, you can actually see we have this local version of Experience Builder. And this is probably the same interface that if you've ever used it in online or enterprise, this is the interface you're used to being greeted with. And so once we're in here, this is where we actually manage all of our experiences. These are essentially, each of them are essentially a web application that we can go into and actually customize. So from there,
yeah, I think so. So now talking about custom widgets and how that fits into this. So when you're running the server and you're running the client, you're doing all your work in the client, but you're also, if you're configuring an application, that application gets actually spilt out, or the configuration for that application gets spit out into your server /public/apps directory. And so for each of those tiles that we just saw in the builder, there is a directory in that server /public/apps, whatever ID of the actual application that you see here is in your directory. And so if you could go to the next slide.
yeah.
Awesome. And so all of this happens through these different technologies that are working together. So in order to actually deliver and actually work on an ArcGIS Experience Builder project using the Developer Edition, you need to first understand React and also TypeScript. So those are the first 2 requirements enabled when you're working on an actual project that you're building a custom widget. If you don't understand at the core in React components and state management and local state and application state, then you can't deliver a high quality widget. And so it's kind of a prerequisite to doing Experience Builder development work is to understand those 2 technologies at the core.
Yeah, and I think as a precursor to explain a little bit, so ArcGIS Experience Builder is essentially wrapping a couple technologies. So like Sean said, TypeScript is actually the language, if anyone is familiar with it, it's essentially JavaScript with extra types. It's kind of, it's a wrapper over JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, you can probably pretty easily learn TypeScript. And then React is actually a web framework that is available completely independent of Experience Builder. And I think that is a place where a lot of people will get hung up, is when they are first learning Experience Builder, they're also learning React at the same time. And so if you're coming into this, you're trying to understand all of these other kind of pieces, as in the GMU core, that's kind of the base building blocks of Experience Builder. It's very easy to get confused between what am I learning right now that is React versus what am I learning right now that is actually Experience Builder. And so basically our recommendation is, while we are going to create a simple widget today, it's going to be bare bones, like simple widget without having to get too far into the specifics of React and TypeScript. And so basically our recommendation is, if you're going to work on a custom widget and you think it's going to kind of build or be a little more complicated than just a very simple piece of state or a very simple display widget, you definitely want to have that React foundation before you get too far into the Experience Builder side of things. So also, as a precursor to all of this, the JavaScript SDK, most of Experience Builder is basically wrapping functionalities around that. And so having some familiarity with the JavaScript SDK for ArcGIS is another kind of important piece. Just because it's very easy when all of these four things come together, it's very easy to kind of lose understanding of how can you understand these separately from each other to best then bring them all together and create custom widgets that are robust. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think if you open up the middle tab. Yeah, so one other thing that we want to talk about too is when you're building an actual custom widget, you need to first create a app item in your portal. And so this app item gives you a client ID, and that client ID is what you use in the builder to tie your builder and whatever application that you're working on to a portal, right? Because you need to add data sources to then use in your widget, and so you need to know which portal you're using to get those data sources from. And so when we're actually in the builder here, before I've even gotten here, before I've even arrived at that screen on the builder with the tiles or empty with no applications, I first need to go here, grab the client ID, and the second thing that I need to do is go to settings, or actually on this page it's down below. Yeah, and so the redirect URLs. For Experience Builder, it uses, out of the box, it uses localhost port 3000 and 3001, depending upon whether or not you're using HTTP or HTTPS. So you need to add those redirect URLs to this app item. And then at that point there, then you can run the builder and get to the builder. Mm-hmm. And so all of these things are built on top of the technologies that we just talked about. And now we'll get into custom widget discussion from here.
Yeah, so now that we're actually gonna start looking at how we can get started with a custom widget, we'll first kind of discuss the structure of what this actually looks like in your directories. So how do we actually integrate this with Experience Builder and add our files so that Experience Builder knows to pick them up and bring them into our experience. So first, we'll kind of just look at this general structure of the client folder. And as we briefly noted before, let me switch back over to VS Code. So as we noted before, we essentially have these two main directories in our Experience Builder SDK. So we have client and we have server. Server is, again, responsible for managing our the current applications that we've actually built. And so you can see we have all these different apps and they have all these different configs inside of them. These are the actual apps we're making, but we're not so concerned about those right now. So we're actually gonna open this client folder first. And this is actually where the core of all of our widget development is gonna happen. And so you can see we have all these different folders in here, and what we're gonna actually do is we're gonna open up our Experience Builder DevOps folder. So this is the one we're using as an example for this presentation. And so basically, we are creating this folder and we need a way for Experience Builder to actually know that this is where we're gonna put our widgets that we're creating. And the way that we do that is actually through this manifest.json file. And so opening this up, I can zoom in a little bit. Opening this up, you see we kind of have a few properties inside of here. And while they're all pretty straightforward, the most important two properties are these name and type. So this name is essentially just the name of the folder that it's held within, and then this type is a way that Experience Builder can essentially kind of scan through all of our folders, and when it sees that we have this type of Experience Builder web extension repo, that's a way for Experience Builder to understand that we are creating custom widgets within this folder. So going back here, you can see this is an even more simplified version. We have a your extensions folder, and within that there's a manifest. So now let's dive a little bit deeper and actually go into one of our custom widgets. So here's a pretty simplified version of a widget and kind of some of the key aspects to what build the base of the widget. So you can actually see here we have another manifest.json, which is another further level of letting Experience Builder know what our custom widget or where it's actually living. So let's head back to the code, open up our widgets folder here, and for today we're gonna look at this get map coordinates widget. So this is basically one of a pretty simple widget that we've already configured, but we'll kind of run through each step of kind of where, if you were starting with a new widget, what is the order in terms of what you should be setting up. So let's first jump into this manifest.json. You'll notice we have multiple manifest.json. You might see it in other parts of the app, but it's just Experience Builder's way of knowing that we are basically communicating some information. So you can see this one has actually a lot more than the one we were looking at before. And this is really just defining many of these properties so that Experience Builder knows how to pull them into the application. So you can see we've created this for 1.13, which is the latest version. And so usually when you are creating a new widget, we have plenty of samples online that you can kind of use those as starters and then build off of them. And they usually have all of these properties already defined with them. So you usually kind of just can use those and then fill in where necessary. Manifest is an important piece. Another important piece is actually this config.json, which I think we'll probably get into a little bit later. But you can also see we have a setting, a source, and a test. And we'll also kind of dive a little bit into each of these individually. So let's move on to the settings folder. And before I even head back to the code, let's actually look at what I am talking about when I'm talking about settings. So if you're familiar with the Experience Builder UI, you know that most widgets have this panel on the right-hand side where you can configure each widget. And so when we're creating custom widgets, we need a way basically to define the content that's inside this panel, basically a way for us to have the user configure the application or the widget on their own. So for this example, we have this coordinates widget actually, and you can see we have this very rudimentary settings section. And so we actually have two different settings. We have one that is actually configuring the current map that we're looking at, and we have one that is configuring the number of decimals that will be shown when the user hovers. So you can see as the user hovers, these coordinates change and they have 4 decimals based on the setting. So now that we have that context, let's actually look at the code one more time. We'll just take a brief look at the setting component. We have just to get a general idea of what this actually looks like. And so now that we're actually jumping into the code, you will quickly see many React-specific, basically, ways of defining things like components, which for right now, I think it's just important to understand that we're essentially defining a function called setting that is rendering a UI that will then be placed in the setting component. So if we just kind of quickly look through this component here, we can actually see that we have a couple of callback functions. These are essentially functions that will be called for when we change the number in our current number of decimals setting. And we also have a on-map widget selected callback. And so these are essentially just ways for us to define some function that we need to call whenever the settings actually change. So scrolling down a little bit more, the syntax might look vaguely familiar. If you're familiar with React, you should already kind of be, you should be able to understand this pretty well, but otherwise, if you're familiar with HTML, it's kind of a HTML-like syntax that we use to declare our UI. And this is another place where we're not going to be able to teach you React in this session. So this is another place where we can give you an idea of what we're actually doing here and give you a reference of how we can actually set up these kind of settings. And then maybe once you have an understanding of React, how you can come back and actually understand what is being declared here. But for all intents and purposes, you can see we are creating this setting row. And really the main thing we want to look at here is this numeric input. When we have a callback set up, so when the numeric input changes, it's going to update our local configuration, which you saw through these callbacks that we have up here. And so for the sake of this presentation, again, there's many things that we could talk about, but I would rather get an idea of, or help you guys get an idea of the overall structure and understanding what actually goes into a custom widget. So this is a pretty common pattern though, where you can see we're calling this on setting change, and that's a way of actually hooking into Experience Builder to let it know that number of decimals has changed. So moving on from the settings, we'll also take a quick look at the actual custom widget. And so the difference now is that instead of looking at this panel that we have on the side here, we're actually going to look at this, how it actually displays to a user that is bringing it into Experience Builder. Let's just look at that in the code. And that exists in this runtime folder. And that's just another convention through Experience Builder. And really, we have the most simplified version where we don't even have the structure that I was showing here. there's actually a way to include translations, but again, we'll kind of just use the base widget. So let's take a look in here. And so again, when we open this up, this is a React component. It is essentially a way for us to define all of our state, which is also a React-specific tool that it essentially is just keeping any changes or the current state of the application, which essentially just means if the user is moving the mouse, we want to save the current coordinates they're looking at. And so you can see we're basically just storing latitude and we're storing longitude. And we'll come back to this section. At the core of this widget, you can actually see we have two different, I guess, so this return function is actually returning a declarative UI. So we're saying return this box that has a couple things in it, and we'll actually kind of just focus on this is where we're actually telling the renderer that we should make the UI update to show the lat lon and then print out the latitude and longitude. So going back to our application, you can see that's exactly what's showing up here. It's just replacing the current number of our cursor. So that's kind of the gist of this component.
And I think that another important piece of this is that it's making use of the GIMU map view component, and that's what's giving us access to the GIMU map view, which in Experience Builder is the actual map view, right? So there's the map view and then the scene view as well. And you can see that GIMU map view component getting access to the GIMU map view is happening in both the settings here that Sam just went through, and also the widget code here in the runtime. And that gives us access to the data. In this case, we're using the web map data source, right? But we could get access to a feature service if we want to directly plug into a feature service, and we don't need the map, the web map, right? But in this case, we're using that data source type. So I think that's another part of the GIMU framework that Experience Builder has. That's another layer of learning when you're getting into this work that you'll understand. If you're using a web map data source, that's what you're interacting with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then just finally to kind of look at the final part of this UI. This is our callback that is essentially saying whenever this GIMU map view component, which again is just a wrapper on the current map view in the scene, whenever that changes, let's set up this handler to watch the view. Whenever the pointer moves on the view, we will actually update our local state.
And at this point, I was just going to say, at this point, you're basically doing the similar things that you would do just if you were interacting with the JavaScript SDK, right? Mm-hmm. At this point, with the view and the event on the view at this point. So really, it's one-to-one at this point that you get the access to it through the component, the GIMU map view component.
Exactly. So let's go back here. And then finally, just as another kind of nicety that Experience Builder provides, they have a way of actually running tests on your components, and they set up a lot of that for you. It's built on top of things like Jest, if you're familiar, but essentially what it's doing is providing us a way to actually test our components without having to make a change, tab back to the other tab, look to see if the change happened, and then this is just an automated way where we can write unit tests for our components, but also even testing the render function. So I'm not going to go through this test too far, but essentially all this test is currently doing is making sure that the widget renders to the page, and then it's checking if the widget has actually instantiated. And so this is actually just another API that GMU exposes. As you can see here, GMU for test. The naming convention is generally GMU for and then a technology, and so it just provides an easy way for us to create unit tests for our components. So yeah.
Yeah, and so like I just talked about, we're using in this case the map view at its core, right? And so we're getting access to it through the component. And then within that, we have, you know, in this case, we're using the web map data source. And every data source, whether it's a web map or feature service or whatever it is, has a data source ID. The widget itself has a widget ID, so when you add it to the builder, you get an ID of that widget so that you can distinguish it from another one. And then within the GMU map view and the GMU map view component, we also have the GMU layer views, which is very similar to what you would see in the JavaScript SDK. And so there's very much you know, intertwinement between the two. And we talked about that at the beginning on the technologies that are incorporated into it. You'll see that throughout, but this is just one example of that happening.
So we actually already kind of have gone through the widget and looking at some of the kind of internal pieces of it. And so I guess another important thing to note that you might see as you're developing a widget and viewing other samples, there's this important, very common aspect of there's kind of two different ways to write React components. And since Experience Builder has been around for a few years, before this kind of new way of writing React components came out, a lot of our examples might still be in this older format. So it might actually just be easier to look at kind of an example of what I'm talking about. So React used to be mostly class-based components, and essentially all that means is every component or widget that you are making was a class, which for those with development experience, that basically just means a collection of properties and functions as basically a JavaScript object. But you can see here, we actually just, when we want to render an application, we're rendering this very simple application of hello world. We're basically just defining this render function as a way for React to understand what we're rendering. We also, more recently, you'll see newer examples using this functional component, which basically is just a simplification or a change in the way of thinking of how to actually create a component. So this is what we were using in our example. We're basically just declaring this function widget, and whatever it is returning at the end of the function, that's actually what is going to be rendered to the DOM. And so just comparing, I mean, the functional components just reduce a little bit of boilerplate, and then they actually introduce some other interesting React mechanics that, again, are things that are better learned from documentation by the official React website, or basically experts that aren't us. Yeah, so should we jump into, yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times when you're doing this work, you're working with a team, whether it be your own team or yourself and clients, however that works out. So it could be your own team and you're working with other developers only. It could be your own team and you're working with configuration folks as well, right? So So how do you work as a team on Experience Builder when you're trying to do some customizations? So in that breath, we're going to talk about collaboration within Experience Builder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this actually comes back a little bit to the idea that we discussed before of creating this manifest.json at the root of our Experience Builder custom widgets folder. And so an important thing here is that this manifest is letting Experience Builder know that these are our custom widgets. And the nice thing about this is that, as you can even see here, we might have other folders with custom widgets, but they can all exist independently. And so basically what that ends up meaning is then if we need to use something like GitHub, it means we can actually just push this whole Experience Builder DevOps example as a whole into this repo, and it makes an easy way for us to isolate our custom widgets from any of the built-in parts of React.
That's right. So it gives you a point at which that all your developers can work from. And then also, too, we talked about the server and how the server holds the app configurations, right? So if you go into server public and then apps, and then you have your app configurations. So in here, if you just create a new item, a new application in your builder, or any of your developers creates a new item, a new application, and just has the shell, it'll create a new app ID down in the server in that public's apps folder. And if you replace the contents of that with, like in this case, the contents of app ID 4, then you'll get all the configuration right away. So someone, another developer that has never even seen the configuration of the application, all they have to do is just copy the configuration from here that they've cloned to the client, right? So they clone that repo to the client. They copy the configuration down to their public apps or public apps directory in that new ID that they've created from that app that they've just created, and they just change all these files out, the info, the config, and then the resources, and then they have the fully configured application right there locally. So they're seeing what you're seeing, and you can keep that up to date as you work on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to reiterate, the config.json is essentially your experience that you are creating. And so as you just see some of the properties in here, it's basically just this is the way that Experience Builder is actually defining this application. You can see some of these are widgets. We have some grid stuff going on in here. We have the ArcGIS map is being added. And so essentially, this is a very easily shareable config.json that can be used across multiple versions of Experience Builder. So say Sean and I are working on a project together, like he said, he can basically just copy my config.json, which we might be sharing through something like GitHub, and it just makes it very easy to reproduce the same development environment across multiple developers' machines. So. Yeah.
And so I think like a lot of you that started maybe have experience working with Web App Builder. So you see some of the parodies and similarities with manifest.jsons being used in Experience Builder, and also the layout of the application within a config that helps with when you want to like promote an application, right? From like say you have a dev, staging, and production. You might have 3 different enterprises, and so you have different data sources at each level, and you have different applications. They have different app IDs. The data sources have different item IDs, right? And so being able to do that and changing the configuration of these as you promote things up in your environment, this allows you the entry point to do that custom-wise. So beyond just an actual widget customization, there's the workflow of working as a team and promoting items, in this case, Experience Builder applications through your system.
Yeah, and if you want a more in-depth guide, we provide a link here. You should be able to access that after the presentation, or if you go to ArcGIS developers, there are plenty of resources for Experience Builder and getting started with a custom widget. So now we're actually going to move on to the deployment phase. First, we're going to talk about kind of the two patterns that we've briefly kind of mentioned before. And the two patterns really are, one is with Enterprise. You're able to create custom widgets and build them and deploy them on an Enterprise. It needs to be Enterprise 11 or greater. And you're able to actually use those within the Enterprise Experience Builder. You're actually able to pull them in the online editor. So you won't need to download Developer Edition to use those widgets. You're able to actually use those, or anyone that has access to your Enterprise Experience Builder can use the widgets there. The other way is through Developer Edition, and as we discussed earlier, with Developer Edition, you're able to actually deploy your entire experience as a fully standalone web application. It spits out an index.html, which then you can put on any form of hosting, such as an S3 bucket or something like GitHub Pages, which we're going to show an example of doing.
Yeah, and so when you're talking about Enterprise, Sam just went through this. Users within Enterprise can build the experience with these custom widgets, and that's the huge benefit there. Reusability, right? So if you have a widget that you're going to reuse for different clients that have this need, then this is a great way to go. And you have a configuration team that would be using it. Then your custom widget is going to be used by that configuration team and deploying it there and using the builder from Enterprise is the way to go. And the only prerequisite there is that it's 11.0 or higher. And I think those are the two biggest points here. But there's links to additional resources as it pertains to this here.
Yeah, and so then this is just a brief look at what actually is output by Experience Builder when you want to deploy this to prod. It essentially is creating this widget that then you can copy over to your Enterprise deployment, and then users will be able to use it from within Experience Builder. And then, as I mentioned before too, Developer Edition, this is actually a way to save it as a standalone web application that you can deploy on something like GitHub Pages, which we are going to quickly cover. And so just to kind of quickly go over some of the brief benefits of automation, especially with working with something like Experience Builder, we're able to, whenever we make changes to the widgets, when we push it to something like GitHub that has continuous integration through GitHub Actions, we can actually set up a workflow to deploy our entire experience. That way we can share our application quickly with other users. Like I said, having something like a CI/CD pipeline, for those of you that are not familiar, this is essentially just a way for us to say, when we make changes to our application's code or our custom widgets, these are a set of actions that can, sometimes it might be running automated tests. In our case, we're going to look at how we can actually automatically deploy a custom experience with our widgets in it. And so we will very quickly kind of just look at an example that we have set up using GitHub Actions and how that might actually deploy your application whenever you make changes to your code. So very briefly, let's look at the Actions tab. And then let's go into our script. And let's actually look at the code that we have in here. And you can see that this is some pretty, the code is a little, basically, instead of walking through each line, line by line, this is a public repository that everyone can have access to after the talk, and you'll be able to kind of read through it more. But essentially, what we're able to do is download Experience Builder through our automated script. It will download that. It will copy our apps. It will copy our widgets into this deployment of Experience Builder, and then it will actually run the build process for us. And so, like I said, if you want to actually dive into specifics here, we'll provide a link to this after the talk, and then you can look at how this might help your workflow, how you could implement this, or how you could use it for another CI/CD pipeline. So essentially, what this does is now, anytime we make a change to the widgets, this is actually going to deploy. For example, on ours, we just have it pointed at GitHub Pages. And so this is another one that we have where we have another custom widget that will just add a feature layer. But the purpose of this whole thing is to very quickly be able to see the changes to the widgets because it can be difficult if, say, you're working with a client who you're making a custom widget for. They want to see, they don't care about the code. They want to actually see like the code running. And so this is a very easy way of having the latest version pushed up automatically as a deployment. So.
And I think one of the keys here too is like in our sample repo, which is available in the slide deck, which is public. One of the things to note is that you can have actually 5 different application configurations, right? So say you're just going through maybe alternative 1s through 5, and you have all these different layouts that you're showing off to your team, your client, whoever it is, right? So you can actually deploy these based on the branch that you want to run, right? So you could have a branch for configuration 1, a branch for configuration 2 and 3, and so on and so forth. And then you can deploy those, right, up to Azure Static Web Apps or whatever if you're using AWS, S3 bucket. And quickly you can see, or some physical machine, something that's inside your firewall, whatever it may be. But quickly you can see the benefits so that when your configuration changes or you add a new custom widget to the configuration, to the app layout, someone else can actually test it right away. And you don't have to run the developer edition locally. And so that's a huge win in those situations when you have those needs. And so that's why this is important. Obviously, ultimately, if you're doing a CI/CD for production, then this plays into that. But it also plays into like the testing and the iterative process of developing not only just widgets but also applications, and this in Experience Builder.
Yeah, and so we wanted to just provide some resources. Again, these slides should be available for download if you want to actually access these resources easier than trying to remember this link. So those should be available after the presentation. And make sure to connect with us on social. And please share any feedback in the application. And with that, we would like to open up for questions. We have about 7 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can try and briefly answer.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm curious because I've never used that test component that you were talking about. What are the advantages of using that over just using F12 and go through your code that way?
Oh, okay. So the question is, what are the advantages of using automated testing for your widget. And the advantages, if you are working on a widget, usually when you're working on a widget as simple as the one we're showing, there's really not a lot of value. But in the case where your widget has some complex functionality where you might make a change, something might change in your application somewhere else, it's basically just another way of validating that your widget has not changed functionality-wise. So it's purely just for your development lifecycle. If you don't need it, you don't have to actually even include it. But it is provided as a way to kind of more easily verify any functionality if you need to do something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was in the Cal site earlier, and they were talking about the widgets. They want a widget to be a web widget and a experience builder widget at the same time. And I didn't catch that. Do you know what he was talking about?
So are you talking about web components?
Maybe that's what he was referring to.
So, and the question is whether or not, or how to develop a widget so that it could be used directly in ArcGIS JavaScript SDK and Experience Builder. And I think the middle ground there is a web component that's agnostic to anything. And so if you build a web component and then wrap it, you can build web components agnostic to Experience Builder, React, whatever framework, whatever, and then wrap it as a widget in Experience Builder. At that point, it's an Experience Builder widget that's just using a web component.
Yeah.
And then conversely, on the other end, you can use that web component as a widget with JavaScript API or a JavaScript API, JavaScript SDK web components.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Sure.
So the developer builder will allow you to wrap the widget?
Yeah, so the question is, will the developer edition allow you to wrap components or web components, right? Yeah, and so essentially what you would have to do is how we were writing our custom component. You might have to create an Experience Builder specific component that then pulls in the component that you may have created outside of Experience Builder. And so in the same way that Experience Builder is wrapping the ArcGIS JS SDK, you would essentially be wrapping this existing component that might work independent of Experience Builder, but we need to basically map some of the inputs from that component to Experience Builder and just making sure that those two are able to properly communicate. You essentially would have to create that bridge between the two technologies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. One more.
Have you figured out a way to share custom Experience Builder widgets with someone else on their own Experience Builder?
Yeah, so the question was if we've figured out a way to share custom widgets with other developers on their Experience Builder widgets, and that's kind of what we were discussing before, is that manifest.json file, that's an easy way for us to essentially isolate our widgets in this folder so that we can easily do something like this, where you can see here, this repo here is essentially matching what we have in Experience Builder itself. And so there's no sharing feature from Experience Builder, but when you integrate it with something like GitHub, you essentially can just both clone the same folder into the client folder in your Experience Builder, and Experience Builder should be able to pick that up automatically.
So it would have to be connected with a GitHub repo in order for
Yeah. So yeah, the question is if it has to be connected to something like GitHub, and yeah, GitHub would essentially be providing the version management and sharing. You could do something. I mean, any form of Git. I mean, you could even Git is like an easy way of keeping it more consistent, but you can even just send it directly to someone as a zip file, and they would be able to bring it into their repo the same way.
Yeah. And so we're at time. I just wanted to say that the build looks like the runner is not running, but our slides, there we go. Our slides are available online at esridevevents.github.io/ArcGIS Experience Builder, customizing, extending, yada, 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 slides. And so, so if you want to go there, it has our code as well that we used. And thank you for coming today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.